Hi guys, so I wanted to make this video just to share a little bit with y'all about Tennessee Williams to help you better understand Streetcar Named Desire and also so that you can just be an informed citizen of the world for your cultural literacy. So here's a picture of Tennessee Williams. If you Google him, literally every single picture of him, he is holding a cigarette, which I'll talk a little bit more a little bit more in a minute. And I picked this quote as the cover page because I think it just says a lot about him. So I'll read it. Arguably America's greatest playwright, Williams was always confronting the future, a shaman with a typewriter. He dug into the darkest depths of the American psyche in search of dramatic truths. So I think we've definitely seen that already in Streetcar, and we will continue to see it in the days to come. Just really what he was so brilliant at doing was exploring, as this quote says, the darkest depths of the psyche. So a little bit about his childhood. I'm not going to read every word of it. But as I talk about this, just think about like the connections you can see to Streetcar Named Desire. His biographer wrote that Tennessee was the most autobiographical of all playwrights, meaning that all of his plays were very much inspired by his real life. So just think about that as I go through this. So he grew up in rural Mississippi. He had a relatively pleasant and happy childhood when he was very young. But as he got older, his life became more and more difficult. So here's a picture of his house in Columbus, Mississippi. Cozy, cute. So he was really close to his sister Rose all throughout his life. They remained close until they were both very old and passed away. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a young woman, so he was very familiar with mental illness. When he was youngish, his family moved to St. Louis from Mississippi to the city, and it says here, the carefree nature of his boyhood was stripped in his new urban home, and as a result, Williams turned inward and started to write. So this is kind of a turning point in his life, and if you ever have a chance to see The Glass Menagerie, this move from the country to the city and the difficulty of that is what that play is really about. But there's definitely a hint of that in Streetcar as well, with Blanche and Stella having come from the farm. One thing that always gets discussed about Tennessee Williams is how terrible his parents' marriage was. People didn't really get divorced in America before like the 60s and 70s. That was considered really a taboo, and it was like legally difficult to do. And so his parents had this like really terrible marriage, but they stayed married all throughout his life. He wrote at one point it was just a wrong marriage. So let's read about his parents, and I think we will see them reflected in the play. So his father was an alcoholic and a traveling salesman. He was rarely home, but when he was really abusive, like physically abusive and also verbally abusive, especially towards Tennessee. Who, by the way, that's not his real name. His real name is Tom. But his father was especially abusive towards him because his father was really masculine, like kind of hyper masculine. And Tennessee was frail. He'd had a really, I can't remember what disease, but like some sort of really serious illness when he was young, and it had made him like physically weak. But he was also effeminate, and he spent a lot of his time writing poetry and like quietly reading in his room. And his father had grown up on a farm and was very like physical and aggressive. And so he really bullied Tennessee and made his life really difficult. One popular story about his father that I always see referenced by biographers is that when his father, like during Tennessee's life, his father was playing in a poker game and a fight broke out, and his father had like most of his ear bitten off. So I think we have definitely seen this idea of the poker night kind of representing those brute, antics, like the caveman antics. And that was something that Tennessee had experienced like in his own life with his father. His mother, on the other hand, was a former Southern belle. She is always described as being very weak and cowardly and frightened by her husband. She definitely did not stand up to her husband when he would bully Tennessee. And Williams later described her in one of his letters, he said she was a snob who was detached from reality. So I think we see this idea of like this kind of sad former Southern belle who's just become kind of pathetic and like, but is still snobby, and is definitely detached from reality in Blanche. I mean, I think all of this describes Blanche to a T. Again, if you ever have a chance to read or see The Glass Menagerie, the mother in that play is like almost completely based on his real mother. But Blanche has a lot of the same characteristics as Amanda Wingfield, the character in Glass Menagerie, and his mother. Okay, so I'm definitely not going to read all this, but when Williams was first trying to go to college, he like went to University of Missouri. He joined ATO. He really did not fit in. Like, he was really unhappy. His fraternity brothers did not like him because he was, as it says, shy and socially awkward and just kind of a loner. He would be in his room writing all the time. So eventually his father withdrew him from school and made him take a job at a shoe factory, which he absolutely hated. It was a good thing, though, because it did give him like a lot to pull from for his future plays. So like all of his plays have these characters who like either work in factories, or they're forced to work in factories, or they used to work in factories. So it actually was a really good thing. And one of the examples is Stanley. So even though Williams had grown up kind of in this like affluent lifestyle with this Southern belle mom, he had worked in factories and like had really gotten to know like this more working class kind of person like Stanley. He was super depressed during this time, and eventually he suffered from a nervous breakdown. He had to be hospitalized in a mental institution to recover. So I don't want to say any more about that until we finish reading Streetcar, but just keep that in mind. So he did eventually go to college and graduate. And after he graduated, he moved to New Orleans. And as it says here, that was where he was able to soak up the lifestyle that would inspire his work. So not all of his plays are set in New Orleans, but definitely like that quote at the beginning, how it said the depths of the American psyche. I think where he really was able to see those, most terrible passions of humanity, like we've been talking about in class, was in New Orleans, because that's what goes down in New Orleans. As we talked about the first day we started reading this play. It was when he was in New Orleans that he changed his name to Tennessee. And that was actually where his father was from. That was really his only connection to it. It's kind of interesting. So his first play that was, that opened on Broadway was The Glass Menagerie, which I've referenced several times. And it was very successful, very much critically praised. It is still a successful play. They did on Broadway, I think last year, they did basically like a Glass Menagerie Part 2, where, they kind of like came up with a sequel to it, which just says a lot about, the play came out in 1945. And I went to New York twice while it was on Broadway, and I tried to get tickets both times, and it was sold out. So I think that says a lot about the longevity of that play, that so many years later, like a made-up sequel, not written by Tennessee Williams, could be so successful. So this is a picture from just like a Broadway version, I think like 10 years ago. So here's our American Horror Story cast. This is the Southern belle mother that I was talking about that was really strongly inspired by Tennessee Williams' mom, who is here played by Jessica Lange. And then here's Sarah Paulson, who is the sister in that play. Okay. So his next play after The Glass Menagerie was A Streetcar Named Desire, which was probably his most like critically successful play. And we've talked plenty about that, so I'm not going to say anything else about that. So over the course of his career, he wrote 25 full-length plays, lots of screenplays for movies and television, 2 novels, short stories, poems, an autobiography. He was awarded 2 Pulitzer Prizes and 4 Critics Circle Awards. So he's definitely like had a lot of success in his lifetime. This is a picture from a law firm. Okay, this is a picture from the movie A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which is another one of his plays that was pretty famous. And this is Elizabeth Taylor and Paul Newman. So if you are like a film buff and you want to watch a good movie, this is definitely a good one. Okay, so this is where his story gets kind of sad. In the 1960s, his work really went into decline, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that he was very heavily addicted to alcohol and drugs by that time. All of the pictures of him, he's either holding a cocktail or a cigarette. I mean, he heavily relied on substances. He also was in a long-term relationship with a male actor, and they broke up towards like in the 50s, I think. And so that's another thing that people attribute his kind of like decline to, is this like, that was kind of the great love of his life, and breaking up with him. So his brother had to hospitalize him for like mental issues and addiction issues. He did come out of the hospital and wrote a few things, but he never really recovered. Like his work that he wrote later in his life just never was as good as the plays that and the screenplays and everything else that he wrote earlier in his life. This last part is really sad. He died alone in a hotel room in New York City. When they found him, he was surrounded by wine and pills. He actually choked on the cap of a pill bottle that he was like trying to take pills out of, which is as low as it gets. So it's kind of, I mean, it's not kind of, it's really sad to think about that when we're reading. And I know we're kind of like laughing about Blanche and like all of her drinking, but that was something that he really struggled with and that eventually took his life. I picked this quote for this slide because I just think it says so much, and you can really see like how similar he himself is to Blanche. So I'll read this. That's right here. And actually, you have this quote on your Salmon study guide. It's like on the front page. Oh my gosh. Just please stop. Okay. All right. So you have this on your Salmon study guide. So I'll read it. Many of the characters he has created would seem to be projections of his own disoriented personality. Frightened, timid, groping, highly sensitive, somewhat neurotic dreamers who, like their creator, are unable to adjust to the harsh realities of a world of crass materialism and brute strength. So as sad as it is, I love that quote because it just describes Blanche so well. Disoriented personality, frightened, timid, groping, highly sensitive, neurotic dreamers. And it's just so sad to me to think of him being like that too, and creating this character of Blanche who we all kind of hate and make fun of. But that was him. Like that was his soul he put into her. Okay. So speaking of that, and I didn't have a fun picture for this because all of this is really important. So if you've been zoned out, please zone in now because I feel like this is the most important part of the slideshow. So I want to talk about kind of the big tension in all of his plays, especially Streetcar. That was also the big tension in his life. So I'm going to read this quote from this actress who played Blanche. She said, this is right here. Williams was attracted to the things that were going to destroy him, alcohol, drugs, sex, etc. And his characters similarly are attracted to and repelled by what they know to be dangerous, what they know they should avoid. That incredible contradiction in so many people is what he captures better than any other writer. I just think that quote says so well kind of the central tension in the play, that Blanche so desperately wants to be civilized and wants to do the right thing and wants to be pure and wants to be a good person, but she can't help but be attracted to these things that she knows are bad and she knows are wrong and she knows that are ultimately going to destroy him. I mean, her, like the drinking and like Stanley. And so I'll read this next quote that goes with that. So Elia Kazan, who was the director of the original Broadway production, and then he also was the director of the film version, the 1947 film we've been watching. So he worked really closely with Tennessee Williams, just like getting the play going and then with the film. So I find it interesting that he said this. Tennessee Williams is Blanche, and Blanche is torn between a desire to preserve her tradition, which is her identity, her being, and her attraction to what is going to destroy her traditions. Okay, so the same kind of thing that this actress said is what Kazan also said. So Blanche and Tennessee Williams both, they want to preserve their traditions and they want to like, you know, follow like the civilized kind of morals that they have been like brought up to believe in, but they also are attracted to the things that are going to destroy those traditions. And then the last one is just, this is something I wrote actually. Mr. Kirsch is still texting me. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, so I'll read this. There's a knowingness in the way the audience, just a typo here. There's a knowingness in the way the audience is invited to lust after, laugh at, and eventually loathe the character of Stanley Kowalski. Like Blanche, like Tennessee Williams, the audience is both attracted to and repulsed by him. So in the play, Blanche, I mean, we've seen she's like flirting with him, but she's also terrified of him. Like she's disgusted by him, but she also seems to be kind of attracted to him. And certainly that was like how Tennessee Williams felt about a lot of things in his life. And I think it's interesting because just reading it with y'all and like watching y'all watch the movie, for example, I would say the number one thing people have talked about is like how attractive Stanley is. But he's a terrible person. And I hope by the end of the play, we will all despise him. And so I think that's very purposeful, that like he can be so charming. And he's like, you know, I heard a lot of y'all be like, I mean, he's cool. Like he is this kind of like interesting, vivacious character. And, you know, he's always cast as someone very attractive, but he's a terrible person. And so that like we are caught up in the same tension that they're caught up in, where we know we shouldn't like him but we kind of do. And we kind of hate ourselves for that because he's very destructive and like he's not a good person. He is a terrible person, as I said. Okay, so why are we reading A Streetcar Named Desire? Well, it's fun. I mean, from your quizzes today, like it seems like a lot of you are really enjoying it, which is great. But I also just wanted to show this to y'all. So this is a list that they always compile of the books that have been on the AP Literature exam the most from 1970 to 2018. So this is the top, I think, like 15 or 20. And I put them in alphabetical order just so you could see. But I put the ones in bold that are the ones y'all have read or will read. So you can see like Song of Solomon, we're going to read next. Y'all read The Grapes of Wrath and The Great Gatsby last year, Scarlet Letter, Othello. We're going to read Hamlet, etc. But what I really wanted to point out about this list is if you think about a book like Great Expectations or The Grapes of Wrath or The Scarlet Letter, those books are great, but they're so long. I mean, they have so many words. Like they're such substantial novels. And what I think is so amazing about Tennessee Williams is that he has 2 books on this list and both of them are short. His plays are only like 100 pages. I mean, they only last like 2 hours. And he's able to say so much and like capture so much complexity with the characters and do so much with symbolism and say so much about human nature in such a short amount of time. And that's so special. That's such a rare gift. And so I just really wanted to point out to y'all that other than Shakespeare, he's the only playwright on this list, period. And obviously Shakespeare is like, you know, he's Shakespeare. So he's the only playwright who's on this list, period. He's also on here twice. And if you look at this list, the only other authors who are on here twice are Toni Morrison, who we're about to read, and Shakespeare. And I think that's it. So I just think it says so much about him that he is able to capture so much about human nature and to do so much in such a short space. Like that is like true mastery of literature. And so to me, that's what I love about plays. And like, that's why I'll be totally honest. Last year when I decided to read Streetcar, I had seen the play and I'd seen parts of the movie, but I had never read the script, but I was like, oh, I want to do a play. Like that'll be fun. And I basically just pulled up this list and I was like, oh, Streetcar. Okay. Like that's on here. So I'll just do that. And it was such a great decision because it really does do so much in such a short time. And I think it's great for us to be able to like read that together and talk about it, which I would love to do with all of our books, but like we can't sit here and read the entire Grapes of Wrath together in class. Like it would take all year. So it's great that we have Tennessee Williams and we can have that experience of reading truly great literature as a class and not have it take an entire school year. Okay. Oh, my last slide was a disclaimer, which is kind of pointless now because we're already in it. But I guess I'll just point this out quickly. Again, I was planning to do this the first day, but I think it's better actually to do it now that y'all are like kind of in it and know more about the play. But anyway, the big criticism of Williams' plays has always been that they're violent and they have this prevalence of like sexuality. Obviously, these are taboo topics. But I think we've done a good job in class of talking about how like none of these things are like the play is not about violence in and of itself. It's not about sex in and of itself. It's all like a representation and a metaphor for like deeper subjects like desire and loneliness and like the inner conflicts within all of us. So I hope you've realized like we're not just reading this to like read a bunch of smut and like just for entertainment value. Like all of these things that are taboo topics and are kind of uncomfortable topics for us to talk about in class have like a much deeper meaning and that like really gets to the heart of like real people's internal conflicts. So I think I already read these other quotes on here, so I'm going to end the video now. I hope you learned something, and I will see you on Tuesday.